and welcome to the third episode of the Charcoal Selfie series. In today's class, I'm going to be breaking down the steps of how to create this hand while working with both black and white charcoal pencils on top of gray toned paper. I'd like to just remind you that this is your starting point and that while working with these charcoal pencils, we will not be able to use all of the details that we see in our reference photo. And the reason why is because we're working on a fairly small scale for this example. Remember that this is just a practice and that when we're working on your final draft, the hands that you're drawing are going to be much larger. So this is just a practice. I don't want you to feel discouraged or overwhelmed in any way. Just remember that this is your starting point where you're just first learning how to work with these tools and how to use the shading techniques that we've been practicing from our first skill building and applying it onto an actual drawing. So give yourself some grace for this episode and know that this is just your starting point and you'll just get better from here. But I will be breaking down the steps very thoroughly so that you can follow along, make sure that you're pausing at all of the appropriate times to get caught up instead of trying to watch this episode all the way through before starting. So let's go ahead and begin. We'll begin by transferring our hand, and to do this step you should either work with a very sharp pencil or a mechanical pencil, and we're going to go around each of the details for this hand, making sure that we focus on first getting those outside edges and then also making sure that we capture the small little lines and details. You can continuously lift and lower your transfer page to make sure that you have all of your lines filled in before you move on to adding your values. We can utilize our value scale that we took the hole punches out of to help us figure out where our values need to go and which values they should be. We will always start by working with our white first rather than adding in our black charcoal first, because we want to make sure that we can smoothly blend out our white before adding in the black and accidentally mixing them together. You should also notice that as I'm working, I have my reference photo page directly underneath my hand that I'm working on shading so that I can use that while I'm working to make sure that I'm matching the details exactly. What we want to avoid is trying to guess and see if we can figure out where all of these values should go. So you'll notice that as I've been working, I've filled in my solid white areas and a couple of areas where it slowly transitions out. And locating all of these spots where we're trying to add in our white and then having it smoothly transition out to the gray is our first step. It's really important to pay attention to the details that you actually see, like noticing that the white goes all the way to the end of the knuckle here on this finger we're currently shading, and same with the value on the next finger. It does go all the way out to the knuckle, making sure that we have a nice smooth transition out back to that gray. I continued adding white on the top of my fingers where it was closer to my fingernail. Even though they are bent backwards, there is still a decent highlight on those sections of the finger. Next, I noticed that there was a little bit of white off to the side closer to the wrist, so making sure that we capture those little white details is really important before we move on to smoothing out any of our value. Once you have all of your value laid out accurately, we're going to go back through with our Q-tip, not the blending stump, but the Q-tip, to work on smoothing out our value so that it has a nice smooth transition out to the gray tone of the paper. So what we're doing here is really getting rid of any of that kind of crispy looking texture. It's the charcoal pencil texture that's left behind that we're trying to get rid of and make it as smooth as possible, because this is part of what helps our picture start to look a little bit more realistic. You should notice that the knuckles on the fingers where they're bent out, not where they're connected to the hand, but where they're bent, is typically a little bit darker. And also notice that our highlights are on one consistent side of the fingers. Once you finish blending with your Q-tip, you should make sure that you have all smooth transitions leading out to the gray tone of the paper. Once our white is perfectly smooth, we're going to start working with our black charcoal pencil, and we're going to begin by adding our darkest parts of our value. So I'm going to locate all of my darkest areas and I'm going to fill in my values there. Now remember that for our medium tones, we're going to use our blending stump. So with our pencil, we really are only trying to fill in our darkest spots. So we're looking for all of those darkest values. There's some in between the fingers. There's some in the spaces where you can see the palm showing through the fingers. And of course, along those little wrinkles on the edge. But we're saving all of our medium tone spaces to fill in with our blending stump. As you can see in the example, these are all of the areas that I thought were important to go through with the pencil before coming in with the blending stump. So these are going to be our darkest areas, and you'll copy this before we start working on blending anything in. Once you've added all of your black charcoal pencil, we're going to come in with our blending stump and we're going to start on the lighter side. And the reason why is because we don't want to start off too dark and just bring that dark value all the way down. So we typically do just start on our lighter end. If you're working with your blending stump and you notice that it's creating all just pretty much one value, that's a good indicator that you might need to clean your blending stump, which means that you would just take it on a scrap piece of paper and twirl it around until the value that you're getting on your paper is lighter than when you started. So we're going to just take our blending stump and work on smoothing out that value, and you should really be paying attention to your reference photo at this point. I think that this is a common place for students' brain to take over and say, hey, we know what a hand looks like. We've been looking at them since the day we were born. We don't need to look at that reference photo, but that's when you really do need to pay attention to the details that are in front of you, because you're looking at this hand at a different angle than you look at your own. There's lots of details that your brain will not naturally add on its own. So we really need to train our minds to focus on looking at the reference photo rather than just relying on our memory. And relying on your memory is truly one of the biggest mistakes that students make at this point. And the biggest thing you can do to help yourself is to really take a look back and forth at your reference photo. Typically, when you're done working with your blending stump, if you look back and forth between your drawing and your reference photo, you'll notice that you did lose some of your darker value, which means that you need to go back through and add another layer with your charcoal pencil. And this is a step that students often skip because they feel like they've already done it, but you really do lose a lot of your darkest values when you bring in that blending stump, because it's stealing those dark values from your other locations and blending them elsewhere. So this is really a necessary part where you go back through and add that final layer of black charcoal. This same step needs to be completed with your white charcoal pencil, because just like you do lose a lot of your black charcoal pencil with your blending stump, you lose a lot of your white charcoal pencil with your Q-tip. And I noticed there were a couple of spots where I still needed to add it just at all, like at the bottom of the wrist, and just going back to reinforce those stronger white highlights along the edges of the fingernails and the fingers themselves. And this is what my final result looked like. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. Before I leave you, I would like to just discuss what I'm looking for when I'm checking your practice for your hand that you've completed today. So what I'm looking for is first that you have these little white sections that are left on the side of the fingers showing where your light source is coming from. I'm also looking to see that you transition back out to the gray tone of the paper before you reach the darker values that you're adding with your black charcoal pencil. So we should be able to see all of the values that you've completed from your first skill building, where you added in all 10 of your values. They should all be present in your hand practice. And if you need to try erasing, you are more than welcome to. And if you would like to just grab another piece of the gray paper to practice again, you are of course always welcome to. So Please come and check with me once you're done with your hand before moving on, so that we can make sure that you're mastering these skills before moving on to the more difficult portions of this skill building activity. Thanks for watching.